Hey everyone, welcome back. It's your guy here, and today we are going to have a very real, very raw conversation about something that directly affects you, me, and every American taxpayer. Because for way too long, we've been footing the bill for a continent that acts like it's too good to pay its own way. I'm talking about Europe for the better part of 40, 50 years. Europeans have been living in a bubble of comfort that they absolutely did not earn. Their national security, free of charge courtesy of the United States military, their industrial energy, dirt cheap thanks to Russian pipelines pumping gas at cut rate prices, their lavish social benefits, 6-week paid vacations, and early retirements, all funded by selling overpriced German luxury cars and Swiss precision machinery to a Chinese market that was hungry for Western status symbols. The three biggest heavyweights on the planet, the United States, Russia, and China, essentially became Europe's unpaid employees. But that gravy train has officially derailed, and the wreckage is not pretty. Let me walk you through the brutal numbers and the even more brutal strategic logic behind Europe's collapse, because this matters to every single American watching. First, let's look at just how bad things have gotten, and I mean right now, in real time, on the ground. That dreamy European lifestyle, high welfare, low work hours, zero stress was never self-sustaining. It was a luxury product, artificially propped up by constant external transfusions of cheap energy, free defense, and easy export markets. The moment those transfusions stop, the filter shatters, and the ugly reality pops out like a bad rash. Just check the hard data from the first 8 months of this year, and this is not some biased think tank report. These are official government and industry numbers. Germany, the so-called economic engine of Europe, saw 14,675 companies trigger bankruptcy proceedings from January through May alone. Let that sink in. 14,675 businesses going under in just 5 months. Then, in the second quarter, another 4,996 firms bit the dust. This collapse wasn't slowing down one bit. It had spread from energy-heavy industries like chemicals and steel to every single link in the downstream supply chain, including auto parts, electronics, and logistics. Germany's top economic institutes think of them as our Federal Reserve on steroids. Just issued a joint warning that bankruptcy rates will keep climbing through the second half of the year. We are looking at the longest consecutive losing streak in more than 20 years. 20 years. That's not a recession, that's a structural meltdown. And when companies die, jobs die with them, and these are not burger flipping gigs. Ernst & Young's mid-2026 report did the math. Germany's industrial sector is hemorrhaging more than 10,000 core jobs every single month on average. From 2019 all the way through August of this year, German industry has slashed nearly 350,000 high-paying, skilled manufacturing positions. And I am talking about precision machinists, tool and die makers, automotive engineers, chemical plant operators, the kind of jobs that built the post-war German miracle. Even icons like Volkswagen and ZF Friedrichshafen names every American car enthusiast knows are now pushing through massive layoffs, plant closures, and restructuring at breakneck speed. This is not downsizing, this is industrial euthanasia. Is Brussels panicking? You better believe it. Back in March, the European Union rolled out its Grand Industrial Accelerator Act, promising to push manufacturing back to 20% of GDP by 2035. Sounds great on a PowerPoint, right? But the latest statistics show manufacturing is still stuck at 14.3%. And capital flight is actually accelerating. Here's a golden rule for you. Companies don't care about fancy legislative titles. They care about operating costs, energy bills, and regulatory stability. When those bills go through the roof, they pack up their machinery, their intellectual property, and their best talent, and they leave. Europe is watching its own industrial base get hollowed out in slow motion, and they have no clue how to stop it. So how did Europe get so incredibly comfortable for so many decades? Let's break it down, because they played the ultimate middleman game, and they played it brilliantly for a while. They took Russia's dirt cheap natural gas, wrapped themselves in America's military security umbrella, built high-end machinery, precision tools, and luxury automobiles, and then sold all of it at massive markups to China's booming middle-class consumer market for a specific window of history, roughly from the end of the Cold War up until just a few years ago, the three big powers, the United States. Russia and China each had a strategic reason to keep Europe afloat, and Europe milked that arrangement for every single penny it was worth. Let's start with energy, because this is the foundation of everything. Europe has almost no domestic oil or gas to speak of, maybe a little bit in the North Sea, but nowhere near enough to run an entire continent. Their entire industrial machine was built on Russian pipeline gas, cheap, steady, and ridiculously reliable. When those pipelines were flowing at full capacity, German factories hummed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at rock bottom energy costs. Even in 2025, after all the political screaming about decoupling and energy independence, Russian gas still supplied about 13% of EU demand, worth over 15 billion euros. That's billion with a B. And here's the real kicker, the part that makes you shake your head in January of this year. 2026, while EU bureaucrats were busy drafting a formal, legally binding ban on Russian gas imports, they imported 2.276 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas in that single month, the highest monthly volume in European history. Let me repeat that, the highest ever. And as of August this year, they were still quietly purchasing Russian origin gas through third country middlemen using shell companies and offshore traders. Their mouths say sanctions, but their pipelines, ports, and bank accounts scream, we cannot live without it. Now, let's talk defense, and this one hits close to home for every single American who pays federal taxes. For decades, Europe's national security was effectively outsourced to the United States through NATO. We parked tens of thousands of troops there. We stationed aircraft carriers, fighter squadrons, and intelligence assets. We provided the nuclear umbrella, the satellite surveillance, and the rapid reaction forces, and Europe. They took all that saved money, all those billions of dollars they didn't have to spend on tanks, jets, and ammunition, and dumped it into free healthcare. Absurdly long paid vacations, early retirement at 55, and generous unemployment benefits that last for years. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg crunched the numbers earlier this year. If Europe were forced to pay just 4% of GDP on defense in 2025, just 4%, which is still less than what we've spent at various points, that alone would cost EU members more than 90 billion extra dollars, 90 billion. And Washington is now pushing them toward 5%, and that's not going away. Now flip that around, for decades, Europe saved hundreds of billions of dollars every single year because Uncle Sam footed the bill. That is a staggering fortune money that built their welfare states, not their armies, and then there's the market, China. For the last 20 to 30 years, China was in full consumption upgrade mode. Its newly affluent urban middle class craved Western status symbols, and European luxury brands and precision tools enjoyed insane price premiums there. In the first quarter of 2026, Germany-China bilateral trade still held at about 61.5 billion euros. That's a massive number. Whether it's high-end CNC machining centers, industrial robots, or three-pointed star Mercedes sedans, European companies could charge whatever they wanted, and the Chinese paid up without blinking. So the formula was dead simple, like a three-legged stool: take Russia's cheap gas, skip the US defense bill, build premium products, and sell them to China at fat margins. Who wouldn't get addicted to that? It was the greatest arbitrage trade in modern history. But why did the three big powers, the United States, Russia, and China, allow this arrangement to persist for so long? Because in that specific historical phase, each superpower needed Europe as a strategic buffer and a useful tool from our American perspective. We poured troops and treasure into Europe because we needed them firmly tied to our alliance system against the Soviet Union and later Russia. Even today, the United States maintains about 80,000 active duty military personnel in Europe. That's the size of a medium-sized city. Under current NATO operational plans, we handle nearly 40% of all combat missions, including air defense, intelligence gathering, and rapid reinforcement. That is not charity, that is the price of keeping Europe in our geopolitical orbit and denying Russia a free hand on the continent. We bought influence, we bought leverage, and we bought a global power base that allowed us to project strength across the Atlantic. It was a strategic investment, not a gift Russia. On the other hand, wasn't just selling gas, they were playing hardcore pipeline politics by hooking German energy giants like E on Uniper and VNG on cheap, long-term Russian supply contracts. Moscow made sure that no European leader could ever push them into a military or economic corner, as long as German industry breathed through Russian pipes. Russia has a de facto veto over European foreign policy, especially on anything related to Ukraine, the Baltics, or the Black Sea. For Moscow, Europe was their most reliable foreign exchange cash machine, hundreds of billions of euros over the decades, and their strategic soft underbelly buffer against NATO expansion. And China, why did Beijing let Europe pocket those huge profits for so long? Because China was playing the longest of long games. They deliberately traded short-term market access for long-term technology transfer. Back when China was climbing the industrial ladder, they desperately needed advanced manufacturing standards, precision equipment, automotive engineering know-how, and quality control systems. Europe had all of that in spades. So Beijing paid premium prices, sometimes 2 or 3 times the domestic cost for German machine tools, French turbines, and Italian packaging lines. They used Europe as a stepping stone to build their own supply chains, train their own engineers, reverse engineer entire product lines, and eventually surpass their teachers. Fast forward to today. The German Machinery and Plant Manufacturers Association, their own industry lobby, now admits that Chinese companies have captured 1/3 of global machinery output. 1/3, that long-term strategic bet has fully paid off, and China no longer needs to overpay for European goods. They are now the world's factory, not Europe. Now the big three, the United States, Russia, and China have all shifted their strategies at the same time. Geopolitics has entered a new, more competitive, more confrontational phase, and suddenly none of us want to keep subsidizing Europe's comfortable lifestyle. The money taps are turning off one by one, and they're not coming back. And Europe, they're panicking like a spoiled kid thrown into a blizzard without a coat. Their first instinct wasn't to reform their bloated welfare systems, reduce energy dependence, or boost competitiveness. No, their first instinct was to throw up defensive walls. Tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, import bans on Russian gas, protectionist subsidies for local industries. But here's the tragic irony, and I want you to hear this loud and clear. Those very defensive moves are accelerating their own collapse faster than any external enemy could. First, tariff self-harm. Starting early this year, the EU slapped punitive extra duties on Chinese electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum. Sounds tough, right? But their own internal impact assessment, the one they tried to bury, came back and slapped them right in the face. Those tariffs made upstream components and raw materials more expensive for European manufacturers, raising overall manufacturing costs across European industries by an average of 7.2%, 7.2%. By August, the big auto-producing countries, Germany, France, Italy, were all fighting each other behind closed doors because their own car makers couldn't absorb the pain anymore. Here's the absurd math that every economist understands for every €1 collected in so-called protective tariffs. They might save one low-skill, dying job in a politically connected sector, but they lose at least €1, often more, in downstream high-end supply chain efficiency. Costs go up, final product prices go up, sales drop, and factories close. It's a death loop, and they built it themselves. Second, energy decoupling lunacy. On January 26 this year, the EU rammed through a regulation to ban all Russian pipeline gas and LNG imports by 2027. Pure political theater, zero economic reasoning, and absolutely no alternative supply chain in place by May. The International Energy Agency reported that average electricity prices hit $111.65 per megawatt hour in the UK and $88.97 in Germany, while right here in the United States, we pay just $28 for the same unit. That's 3 to 4 times higher. In early August, several old-line chemical plants in Germany and France announced permanent shutdowns because they simply couldn't afford the gas bills anymore. Europe's heavy industry, the very foundation of their export economy, now pays over 50% more for electricity than their Asian competitors in China, South Korea, and Japan. That is not decarbonization, that is deindustrialization, plain and simple. Third, security panic triggering a capital stampede. In June of this year, U.S. Defense Secretary Hegseth went to a NATO ministerial meeting and publicly tore into European allies, saying, and I'm paraphrasing, that they are dangerously dependent on American protection and need to grow up. He then launched a formal 6-month review of all U.S. troop deployments in Europe. That's Washington speak for I might not have your back anymore. So start writing bigger checks and fast by mid-August. The political pressure had only intensified, and the review was leaning heavily toward a significant drawdown unless Europe pays up. Now, in 2026, with inflation still running hot, tax revenues shrinking, and social expenditures exploding, Europe is being forced to sprint toward 5% of GDP for defense spending. That money, the very same money that should go to industrial bailouts, Unemployment benefits, healthcare, and infrastructure is now being hijacked by expensive weapons, procurement, missile systems, and jet fighters. So let's sum it all up. Because this is the triple barrel shotgun, they aimed at their own feet. Tariffs raise costs, energy bans kill heavy industry, and forced military spending drains the welfare budget. They are doing this to themselves, and nobody is coming to save them. So where does Europe actually stand today? In a historic, irreversible, and self-inflicted retreat. The global surplus that funded their lifestyle for half a century is completely gone. And the most brutal shift of all, the one that nobody in Brussels wants to admit in public, is that the China-EU trade relationship has completely flipped. We Americans used to see Europe as the premium seller and China as the eager buyer. Not anymore. Not even close. Apollo Global Management, a major US asset manager that tracks global capital flows, released data showing that from mid-2024 to August 2025, Germany's industrial equipment trade balance with China flipped from a surplus of about 750 million euros a surplus, meaning they made money, to a deficit of 500 million euros. That's a swing of over 1.2 billion euros in just over a year. And that deficit kept widening through August of this year, 2026. That trend is not reversible, it's structural, it's demographic, and it's technological. Even more jaw-dropping is the auto sector. In the first quarter of this year, Chinese car exports to Europe surged 84.7%. That's nearly double, hitting 438,400 units. Just last July, the German government started handing out hefty direct subsidies to local EV buyers, taxpayer money, to protect their own struggling automakers. And what happened by early August? BYD alone, a single Chinese brand, registered over 5,240 new cars in Germany that month. That means German taxpayers are funding subsidies, and their own consumers are walking into showrooms and buying Chinese cars instead. How humiliating is that? It's like paying someone to take your lunch money. The International Monetary Fund, the MF, estimates that from 1980 to 2026, the EU 27's share of global manufacturing has plummeted from 27.43% to about 14%. That is essentially cut in half from more than a quarter of the world's factory output to barely 1/7. Industrial hollowing out on that scale leads directly to massive long-term job destruction. EU Employment Commissioner Roxana Imzacu publicly warned, and I'm quoting directly, that in 2026 alone, core sectors like automobiles, chemicals, and heavy engineering could shed up to 1.3 million jobs. 1.3 million. And by mid-August of this year, more than 3,000 core manufacturing firms, not small mom and pop shops, but serious industrial companies, had already moved production capacity out of the EU. And here's the part that should worry every American. Half of those relocations came straight to the United States, and the other half went to China. That is not a rumor. That is documented, audited capital flight. So we have to ask the final, uncomfortable, unavoidable question: what can Europe possibly rely on to survive this collapse? Let's be brutally honest, and I mean brutally because sugarcoating doesn't help anyone. Living off past glory, past subsidies, and past prestige won't cut it. They are losing the old industrial races, cars, machine tools, chemicals, and they aren't even competing in the new ones: AI, semiconductors, batteries, biotech, or advanced computing. Europe is about to face two painful, unavoidable, and very public resets. First, their welfare state will have to shrink dramatically, and I mean dramatically. Ordinary European families, whether they live in Berlin, Paris, Milan, or Madrid, better get used to longer working hours, later retirements, lower pensions, fewer freebies, and much higher out-of-pocket costs for healthcare and education. The age of the 30-hour work week, the 5-day weekend, and the 2-month paid summer holiday is over. That era is dead and buried. They will have to work like Americans just to maintain a fraction of their former lifestyle. Second, their industrial strategy has to amputate, and it has to happen fast. They simply cannot compete across the full manufacturing spectrum. Anymore, they don't have the energy cost, the labor flexibility, the regulatory speed, or the innovation pipeline. Their only realistic shot, and this is a long shot, is to retreat into a handful of ultra high-end, ultra specialized niches, specialty chemicals, aerospace components, medical devices, luxury fashion, and maybe a few areas of precision optics. They have to abandon everything else and pray that those few castles can hold against Chinese and American competition. That is not a strategy. That is a survival reflex. That is the raw, unfiltered, unvarnished reality. Europe's free ride paid for by American troops. Russian gas and Chinese checks is officially over. They are on their own now. No more free security, no more cheap energy, no more guaranteed export markets. The bill has come due and they have no idea how to pay it. Thanks for watching, folks. Drop your takes in the comments. I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next video.